This is the Listening Tube.
Hello, and thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. I'm your host, Bob Woodley. On this episode, we'll learn how the Queen of England got her surname. Is that sexist? And look at when Democrats joined Republicans to override a presidential veto that kept unions in check. And what happens when the red phone rings at the White House? But first,
Not the headlines!
in case the world still has any doubt about the aspirations of the tyrant dictator Vladimir Putin, even after capturing the Crimea in 2014 and the current war in Ukraine, here's more proof that Russia is looking to not only expand Russia back to the size of the former Soviet Union, but also seeking to weaken NATO. To that end, Russia will look at repealing its recognition of independence of former Soviet states like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. It's an administrative tactic to take advantage of Clause 6 of the NATO Charter. Russian lawmaker Yevgeny Fedorov says that because of Clause 6, the moment Russia disputes the borders of those three Baltic countries, they won't be allowed to remain in NATO. So basically, Russia is saying that if we don't recognize them as countries, they won't be allowed to join the treaty. Well, in my research, I couldn't find Clause 6 of the treaty. I found Article 6, which defines what an armed attack is and where it would have to happen to get the rest of the members involved, but it doesn't say anything about disputed borders, or if a country with disputed borders is or is not allowed in NATO. This seems like a far-fetched plan to use some loophole interpreted by the Russians to make NATO expel members. It won't work, but it's an example of the kind of tricks the Russians are willing to play in order to get their way. 14 countries joined NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union. Many were members of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet version of NATO. If the tyrant Putin wants to put all that back together again, he probably should have started a long time ago. The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th break-in at the Capitol has now gone prime time. It's not exactly pulling in prime time audiences, though. 20 million people did watch the first installment, but audience participation evaporated quickly. I understand people's curiosity. Americans want to know how it was allowed to happen. But that's not what the Select Committee is really interested in telling us. The committee seems focused on finding ways to blame the people working in the White House at the time. What we're not hearing is why the security at the Capitol building was so sparse and unprepared. Look, we already know what happened, and we already know who went in there and caused damage and took things that didn't belong to them. This primetime show trial is a mockery of justice. Just hearing the way the questions are asked is a tip-off that this isn't a hearing, it's a performance. Look at the teleprompters in the room. They're reading off pre-written scripts, questions to which they already know the answers. In an actual hearing, you wouldn't first ask, "Who was with you when you went there?" No. You first have to ask if anyone went with you. Then, if the answer is yes, you ask, "Who went with you?" You can't first ask, "What did he demand of you on that phone call?" No. First, you must ask if any demand was made. If there was, then you ask what demand was made. This is a show trial, and nothing else but an effort to prohibit Donald Trump from ever holding office again. We will learn nothing valuable by watching. Everyone who committed a crime that day has already been identified, and justice will prevail.
Let's go back through the Listening Tube.
This week in 1611, Henry Hudson was set adrift in Hudson Bay during a mutiny. Yes, the bay that was named after him, as well as the company called the Hudson Bay Company, which traded beaver pelts, was the last place Henry Hudson was seen alive. After waiting for the ice to free his ship in the springtime, Captain Hudson decided to continue exploring Hudson Bay, his fourth voyage there from England. Ultimately, the crew decided they wanted to go home. Henry Hudson, his son, and other crew who didn't support the mutiny were set adrift with minimal supplies. Few of the remaining crew survived the journey back home, though, where they knew they would be tried for mutiny. But they blamed the whole thing on two of the men who died on the voyage home. The rest were convicted of murder, but were never punished. This week in 1633, Galileo Galilei is forced, by Inquisition, to abjure, curse, and detest his Copernican heliocentric views. Galileo, the Italian astronomer and engineer, among other things, had argued 20 years earlier that the Earth revolved around the sun. Not the other way around, as had been the prevailing assumption since the time of Aristotle. But Galileo was an observational scientist and a builder of telescopes. He knew that the movement of the stars in the sky could not be explained if the Earth was at the center of the universe. At the time, of course, the universe was only what we could see from here and no more. He had already been told in 1615 that he was rubbing the wrong way the leaders of the Catholic Church, who considered his support for the Copernicus model a contradiction of Holy Scripture. Copernicus had come up with the idea almost 100 years earlier. Galileo's observations confirmed it, yet because he wrote an essay that was deemed to support the theory after he was ordered to forget it, he was sentenced to home confinement for the rest of his life, which, as it turned out, was about 9 years. So even then, the powers that be could, and did, control information and how people thought. Today, Galileo could have started a Kickstarter page and sold telescopes on heliocentric.com. Also today, more and more people in power, and those looking for power, are trying to tell us what we can and cannot say, what we can and cannot write, and what we can and cannot believe. A recent rallying cry was, "Trust the science!" As it turns out, people have been saying that for 500 years. In 1782, Congress approves the Great Seal of the United States and the bald eagle as its symbol. The Great Seal of the United States is full of symbolism. Each part of it has purpose or pays tribute to our origin and values. The color white, for example, signifies purity and innocence, and we all know how pure and innocent our country is. Pure as the driven snow, and as innocent as O.J. Simpson. The red signifies valor. Can't argue with that. Americans aren't afraid of anything, especially going to battle. The only times our military has failed is when politicians held them back. The blue signifies vigilance, perseverance, and justice. Where the blue is displayed indicates it represents our executive branch. One can certainly question the vigilance of the current administration. It seems like the White House is constantly surprised by what happens when everybody else saw it coming a mile away. Some examples would be the exit of Afghanistan and the baby formula shortage. The part I like about the Great Seal is what the eagle is holding in its claws. In one, arrows as a symbol of war. In the other, an olive branch as a symbol of peace. The eagle is always facing the olive branch, indicating our preference for peace, but readiness for war. Speaking of war, it was this week in 1807 that British troops board the USS Chesapeake, a provocation leading to the War of 1812. For some reason, this week 5 years later, in 1812, the War of 1812 begins as the United States declares war against Britain. Okay, wait a second. Maybe I should have paid more attention in history class, but I have some questions here. Why did the British board the USS Chesapeake? Why did it take 5 years to declare war? Didn't we recently beat them in a war for our independence? I'm going to look that up.
He's gonna look it up. He's really gonna do it.
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Why, yes, the United States did just beat Britain in a war. The United States had recently become a sovereign nation, and no longer had the protection of the mighty British Navy. In 1807, what little navy we had was patrolling the Mediterranean Sea, keeping American trade ships safe from pirates. When the British boarded the USS Chesapeake, there wasn't a whole lot we could do about it at the time. But the people of America were extremely upset, and as President Thomas Jefferson said at the time, were more united against the British than they were even prior to the War of Independence. So why are the United States and Britain fighting again? Why did the British board the USS Chesapeake? Believe it or not, they were looking for 5 men who deserted a British ship. The ship was patrolling the coast of Virginia, and for whatever reason, the 5 men stole a boat, left the ship, and got to Norfolk, Virginia. One of the men bragged about the crewman's escape to the land of liberty, and word got back to the British authorities. British spies must have kept an eye on the guys, and one of them eventually became a crew member of the USS Chesapeake. The USS Chesapeake, although armed, was being used primarily as a cargo ship when it set sail for the Mediterranean Sea, only to be intercepted by His Majesty's ship Leopard. The British commander requested permission to board the Chesapeake to look for deserters, but the American Commodore refused. Next thing you know, the British ship is firing its cannons, killing 3 American sailors and wounding 18. The British found the man they were looking for, as well as others. So, it was basically 5 British guys and a British ship commander who are responsible for starting another war between the former colonies and the British Empire. There's still debate about who won the War of 1812. The British claim they won, even though they weren't really that into it, as they were also fighting another war elsewhere. The Americans claim we won because we went up against the most powerful navy in the world and didn't give up any territory back to the British. And although the British did burn down Washington, D.C., which only Black Lives Matter can also claim, the war ended 3 years later with a treaty that has maintained mostly peaceful relations with one of our closest allies today. This week in 1868, Christopher Latham Sholes patents the typewriter. I can't tell you how grateful I am for the typewriter. If I had to write this program by hand every week, my fingers would have shriveled up and fallen off by now. I don't have a staff, and speech-to-text software isn't advanced enough.
The listening tube will return at the speed of sound. Contact the listening tube by calling 570-601-1101 or by email thelisteningtube@outlook.com.
This week in 1870, the Department of Justice becomes a cabinet-level federal agency. Like the Department of Education, it had lofty goals, but alas, has come up short. It doesn't matter what laws we make if those same laws are not enforced. Our current Attorney General, the top law enforcer in the land, seems to be selective as to which laws should and should not be enforced. It's not all his fault, of course. He's taking his cues from whomever is in charge at the White House. Making the Department of Justice cabinet level means the department doesn't work independently. Whereas we see justice as blind, the Department of Justice sees justice as whatever makes the current administration happy. What crimes we can get away with depends on who's in charge of enforcing the laws. Ask the cops in New York City and Los Angeles. And in 1917, after World War I, King George V, after whom this episode is named, ordered members of the British royal family to dispense with German titles and surnames. They took the name Windsor. So if you want to write a letter to the Queen, you may address the envelope Elizabeth Windsor, Queen of England, Buckingham Palace, London, England. It should get there, unless there's some other lady whose name is also Elizabeth Windsor, and she also lives in London. You never know, so I would definitely put that Queen of England part in there so there's no mistake. And don't just write Queen, because then it might go to the Queen of some other country, or Brian May, the May Queen. This week in 1947, vetoed Taft-Hartley Act overridden by Congress. President Harry Truman vetoes the bill, which was written to keep unions in check. It was actually called the Labor Management Relations Act, and it specifically restricted the activities and power of unions. Over the past 12 years, since the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, unions had let their newfound power go to their heads. It led to strikes that not only disrupted commerce, but led to pressure of unrelated unions to join strikes that would have no advantage to them. The Taft-Hartley Act was the work of a newly elected Congress that gave Republicans their first majority since the early 1930s. But it wouldn't have overridden a presidential veto without substantial help from Democrats. In fact, 126 out of 229 Democrats voted for the override. Today, you probably wouldn't see a Democrat vote for anything detrimental to unions. In fact, I just saw a post on social media from the Democratic Party that said, "President Biden is the most pro-union president in American history." I guess we could debate that if you want, but what interests me most is why the Democrats are so beholden to just 11% of the American workforce, while ignoring the other 89%. Now you might say, "Come on, Bob, it's the money." And you would be right. Here's the irony. The Taft-Hartley Act, according to First Amendment scholar Floyd Abrams, was the first law barring unions and corporations from making independent expenditures in support of or in opposition to federal candidates. From then on, it was the union's goal and the Democrats' agenda to find ways around the law. Not surprisingly, they did. This week in 1948, Toast of the Town, hosted by Ed Sullivan, premiered on CBS television. Also in 1948, the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift began. Having been stationed in West Berlin, working in the media there, and having a son there today, this story brings me great pride in what America and our allies were able to accomplish. Today, there are a lot of people who don't remember the way Germany and the city of Berlin were carved up by the winners of World War II. Many assume Berlin was cut in half because it was on the border between what became East and West Germany. That's not the case. The entire city of Berlin was inside East Germany. Nikita Khrushchev called it a bone in the throat of communism. Years after World War II, the Soviet Union decided it wanted all of Berlin, despite the Four Powers Agreement between the Soviet Union, England, France, and the United States. To that end, the Soviets put blockades in place and began building what would become the Berlin Wall. The Allies rallied and put the power of the international agreement and the power of flight to work. It took more than a year of non-stop supply flights into the three western sectors of Berlin, but the Soviets eventually relented. They never did gain control of West Berlin. The wall came down in 1989, and Germany was reunified in 1990. The West had won the Cold War. But before any of that happened, this week in 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing Prison in New York. They were convicted of spying for the Soviet Union. It was a little harder to execute Ethel. The initial 3 jolts didn't do the trick as it did for her husband. She needed 2 more. There were a lot of people who believed they were innocent, including their sons. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union, when government records from the era became available to the rest of the world, was the conviction confirmed. Soviet records showed that Julius was the courier of classified information and his wife Ethel often typed up the documents. She also recruited her brother into the spy ring. And this week in 1963, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics agreed to set up a hotline. The purpose of the hotline was to reduce the likelihood of nuclear war. The truth is, it's not red. It's not even a phone. Never was. It was basically a teletype machine that didn't even have lowercase letters on it. So, as it turns out, when we sent the first test message to Moscow, we yelled at them. "The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Over!" Probably not a great first impression. It's been used about a dozen times in the last 60 years. The last time was when President Obama used it to warn Russia that any election interference would be a grave matter. Ironically, his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, would use the Russians to interfere with her own presidential campaign against Donald Trump. As it turns out, the Russians were just as surprised as we were. This week in 1966, Georges Lemaitre, the originator of the Big Bang Theory, died at 71. I only mention this because I'm deaf in one ear, and I recently asked my wife what she wanted to watch on television, and the response I heard was, "Your back is hairy." I've never heard of a TV show called Your Back is Hairy, and I know I don't have a hairy back, so I was a bit confused. Seeing the confusion on my face, she said louder, "Big Bang Theory." Ah, excellent choice. The Big Bang Theory was the closest thing we ever got to All in the Family when it comes to the realities of race and religion in America. Plus, it's really funny. Your back is hairy. In 1968, Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren resigns. He was confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 1954 as Chief Justice, having been nominated by President Eisenhower. He wasn't on the Supreme Court for very long, relatively speaking, but was involved in a lot of important cases such as Brown versus Board of Education. Today, the Supreme Court justices, at least the ones considered conservative, are threatened by radical militant leftists. They are enduring protests at their homes, which is against the law. Unfortunately, those laws are not being enforced by the people who need to enforce them. Because the left is in power, it's okay for their minions to break the law. And in 1970, President Nixon signs the 26th Amendment. After World War II, the Korean War, and in the middle of the Vietnam War, it was decided that if a person was old enough to fight and die for their country, they should be able to vote for the people who might be sending them to war. The legal drinking age was once dropped to 18 from 21. Not all states made the move, but those that did eventually changed it back to 21. Now we're making laws to increase the age to buy certain firearms from 18 to 21. Yet for some reason, children as young as 8 are being trusted to decide what gender they want to be. And this week in 1977, oil enters the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. 38 days later, it reaches Valdez. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline is still in operation today, but transports a lot less oil than it has the capacity to move. President Biden, on his first day in office, canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, and during his campaign promised to end our dependency on fossil fuels. Because of the threats, American oil companies have underinvested in exploration. Production is down, and the embargo on Russian oil has made supplies tight. As a consequence, we're paying record-high gas prices.
Well, that can't be right.
And this week in 1982, the Equal Rights Amendment goes down to defeat. The story of the Equal Rights Amendment is an interesting one. It was first introduced in Congress in 1923 and states that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And further, that the Congress shall have the power to enforce, by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article. It's a pretty simple statement. But the U.S. Senate didn't approve the amendment for another 49 years. When it was approved in 1972, the amendment had a lot of initial support, getting 30 of the needed 38 states to ratify in the first year. But then the support stopped. Not to worry, as states had 7 years to decide. When 1979 came and went, the deadline was extended to 1982. I happened to be in broadcasting school at that time, and in the television part of the school, each of us had to create a TV feature production. Each student had to come up with a topic, write the script, determine what film, video, and other graphics were needed, and in what order, and assign our classmates to a specific duty in the production. All scripts had to be submitted for approval prior to the day of the production. I chose the Equal Rights Amendment for my TV feature. I wrote the script, compiled the visuals, did all the paperwork, made all the preparations, and submitted the script. It was rejected. So the day before production was scheduled to begin, I had to find another topic and start over. I ended up doing my feature on body language. So why was my Equal Rights Amendment script rejected? I was told there were a couple of things in the script that ruffled some feathers, but the last line was the clincher. It said, "If the Equal Rights Amendment fails, ladies, I guess you'll just have to take it like a man." Although the Equal Rights Amendment didn't get the required states to ratify before the deadline, that wasn't the last we've heard about it. In fact, the state of Virginia ratified it just 2 years ago, becoming the 38th and last needed. Supporters are trying to get Congress to rescind the 1982 deadline, and if they're successful, the Equal Rights Amendment would become the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Speaking of rights, everybody has some rights, but not everybody has the same rights. This leaves some people feeling vulnerable. The people with lesser rights may look at those with more rights as spoiled or special, or perhaps they feel cheated and disrespected, or they wonder why other people have more rights than they. It's okay to feel that way. But sometimes people have rights that other people don't have because of the role they play in society. For example, Supreme Court justices have a special right that prohibits demonstrations in front of where they live. There's a law against it. Our justices have a special right to privacy that the rest of us don't have, under not one, but 2 laws. Still, after the leak of an opinion by one of the justices about abortion, left-wing radicals posted online the addresses of those justices they consider conservative. That led to protests in front of Supreme Court justices' homes. Not just people picketing, but banging on drums and being disruptive throughout the entire neighborhood. Be glad you don't have a conservative justice living in your neighborhood right now. So, even though the Supreme Court justices have rights the rest of us don't have, those rights are in place for a very good reason. We can't have mob rules in the Supreme Court. You cannot petition the court by carrying signs and banging on drums in front of their homes. So why aren't the people doing this getting arrested? That's an easy one. It's because the people in charge of enforcing the law agree with the protesters. Now, the special rights that have been bestowed upon the liberal mob are overriding the actual written laws and rights of the Supreme Court justices. How despicable and sad is it that our federal government will not bring themselves to enforce the law when left-leaning radicals are the ones breaking it? Yet we have a show trial of right-wing radicals. Nobody from the Biden administration will condemn the protests at justices' homes. Nobody from the Biden administration will condemn the violence aimed at religious institutions and pregnancy centers. Nobody from the Biden campaign would condemn the rioters across the country in the summer of 2020. Why? Because the law doesn't apply when you're doing the dirty work of those in power. The Listening Tube is written and produced by yours truly. Copyright 2022. Thank you for putting your ear to the listening tube. I'm your host, Bob Woodley, for Thou ad Infinitum.